Okay, so we are covering adolescence, body and mind. So now we are in the adolescent category, talking about puberty. We kind of already touched base on a lot of these things in lecture, so I'm going to go through some things faster than others. But about 100 years ago, adolescence only lasted a few months and started at around age 15. It is getting earlier now and lasting longer. So now it lasts a decade or more. We do have a separate period called emerging adulthood that has been identified. So this is kind of the bridge between adolescence and adulthood. Puberty is different for everybody. The time it lasts, the time it starts, it's all different for everyone. So puberty is technically the time between the first rush of hormones and full adult physical development. So it can last 3 to 5 years, and as I said, it's different for everyone. It takes a lot more years to actually become fully mature, psychosocially speaking. So your adult brain fully developed, that takes years after puberty. So menarche is the first menstrual period for a girl. This basically lets you know that she started ovulating so she can become pregnant. Ovulation and menstruation are often irregular in the first few years, but average age is about 12 and a half for girls that have a normal weight. We talked about how they have to reach about 100 pounds before this will begin, but for normal weight it's about 12 and a half. As I said in lecture before, it used to be 14 to 16, and now it has dropped down to 10 to 12, and it could drop down to even 8, 9 years old. And like I said, everybody's different, so there are girls that get their periods when they're 8 or 9 years old. And basically that means they can officially become pregnant now. Spermarchy is the boy's first ejaculation of sperm. This can actually occur as early as infancy, but once the ejaculation occurs, that lets you know that sperm is actually being produced. The average age is just under 13 years, but again, it can occur earlier. It just really depends on the boy. Hormones we talked about already, but hormones are your body's chemicals. They regulate a lot of biological processes. Hormones are secreted by endocrine glands. Various hormones influence different urges, emotions, thoughts, behavior. They underlie differences in psychopathology because some people have more of a particular hormone or do not have a particular hormone. So we talked about serotonin, for example. If you do not have enough access to serotonin, you may be given Prozac, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which basically leaves serotonin out in the synapses for a longer period of time so that you have access to it. And it's used to treat depression. So different hormones, different hormone levels underlie a lot of the differences in psychopathology between individuals. Kind of already talked about this too, the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is run by the hypothalamus, and it produces a lot of hormones that regulate growth, control other glands, and we talked about in particular the adrenal glands that they control. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys, and they produce the stress hormones like cortisol that we talked about in class today. Also epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is the adrenaline and noradrenaline that we talked about today, that rush when you get excited, when you get stimulated, get that adrenaline rush. That is epinephrine being released. It is your sympathetic nervous system that is releasing the epinephrine and norepinephrine. And we also talked about cortisol, the stress hormone, being released long term and how it can hurt the individual, sometimes significantly. So it's very important to learn how to control your stress and have some sort of outlet for that stress. So the gonads are the sex glands. As I said in class, the ovaries are the females, the testes are in males. They produce hormones and gametes, so they produce the sperm and the egg. Estradiol is the sex hormone. The chief one is estrogen. Females produce more than males do, but males do have it. Testosterone is the opposite. It's the male hormone, secreted more in males than females, but females, again, they do have it. So estrogen and testosterone are the two main hormones that are responsible for our secondary sex characteristics and sex drives, things like that. So the body, brain, and behavior always interact. You have to remember that. Sexual thoughts can actually cause physiological and neurological processes, not just be a result of them. So just thinking about sex can cause reactions, basically. Cortisol levels at puberty increase, so that increases the likelihood of anger or frustration because that signals that you're under some sort of stress. And emotions, of course, are going to increase your hormones. The circadian rhythm is the day-night sleep cycle of activity. It happens about every 24 hours. Hormones in puberty cause a phase delay in the sleep-wake cycles, so that adolescents do not sleep the same way that adults do. They do not sleep the same way that middle childhood do. They don't have the same sleep patterns, which we're going to talk about in a second. So biology, the circadian rhythms, and culture work to make teenagers increasingly sleep deprived with every year of high school. We're going to look at a chart in a minute that shows you that starting freshman year going to senior year, the decrease in the amount of sleep that children get. And that could be because of parties. It could be because they're on their computers all the time or phone all the time. It could be because they have a lot of homework. But whatever the reason behind it is, seniors get a lot less sleep than freshmen do. So here is the chart, percent getting at least 8 hours of sleep on school nights. You can see it goes down significantly from 9th grade to 12th grade. So as a freshman, about 37% of girls get it and about 42% of boys. Then by the time they reach senior year, it goes down to about 22% of girls and 25% of boys that get at least 8 hours of sleep a night. So that's a significant decrease. They say research suggests that the blue light spectrum from TV and computers, the blue light that it emits, actually interferes with sleep. So that could be part of the reason. I know some children, or adolescents I should say, some adolescents have to have their TV on at night just for the light in the room kind of thing. Or they leave their computers on not thinking about it. And like I said, research shows that emittance actually interferes with our regular circadian rhythms. So you have opposing perspectives in your book talking about algebra at 7 a.m. So do adults fight against what is natural to adolescents? When school starts early, we have early sleep, early rising expectations. What this does, though, is it increases sleeping during classes. Kids are getting to school late all the time. They have disruptive behaviors and depression. Basically just because they have to be at school by 7 a.m. doesn't mean they're going to go to sleep at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. They have a tendency to stay up until midnight on a regular basis, so the earlier school starts, the less sleep they're going to get. The more they're going to fall asleep during their classes and get there late, act out, be depressed. So they actually had groups, the sleep versus the wake groups. The sleep stood for Start Later for Excellence in Education proposal. The wake stood for Worried About Keeping Extracurriculars. So they both had different reasonings for wanting school to start early or later. The sleep side, of course, wanted school to start later so that they could see, how it impacted sleeping during class, getting there late, disruption, all of that. The wake groups wanted classes to start at the same time that they were earlier, 7:15, 7:20 a.m., because they had arguments that it hindered teachers with second jobs, that they couldn't make it to their second job on time. It hindered after-school activities if they didn't have a lighted field. It hindered students getting after school jobs, because the later they got out of school, the later they could get to work. It hindered the buses because they had to drive during rush hour traffic. It would hinder tutoring after school because you get out later, you start tutoring later. And it would also hinder the older children helping out babysitting. If they got out of school later, they couldn't babysit their younger siblings who got out earlier. So they had this big debate. Well, what happened was they found that if school started later, they went from 7:25 to 8:30 and 7:15 to 8:40. They got out around 3:20 or something like that. But what they found was if school started later, the kids fell asleep less during class. They got to school on time. There were less disruptive behaviors, less depression. Everything got better. All of the problems got better. So they were still going to bed at the same times, but because school started later, they could get that little bit of extra sleep. So what the American Academy of Pediatrics actually recommended was that high school classes should not start until 8:30 or 9 a.m. Unfortunately, only 43% of the high schools do this. And it's a shame, because with all of the benefits that they have seen, why wouldn't you want your students to be more successful in class and staying awake in class and not being depressed and getting a little bit more sleep? They're not going to go to sleep earlier just because they have to get up earlier. They're adolescents. This graph actually shows fatigue among middle and high school students. So students who fell asleep in class or are too tired to exercise. Not shown are students who were too tired overall, which was actually 59% of high school students, or who doze in class almost every day, which was 8%. So those that even do this once a week, it's pretty significant. It's over 30%. Too tired to exercise, too tired to sleep. Too tired so they fall asleep in school, compared to middle childhood, grades 6 through 8. High school is a lot higher. And again, that's because adolescents have this surge of hormones that are happening. So they're not going to go to sleep as early as middle childhood schools. So genes and gender, about 2/3 of the variation in the age of puberty is actually genetic. Genes on the sex chromosomes have a marked effect on the age of puberty onset. Girls generally develop faster than boys. Girls generally mature faster than boys. And children who have a relatively large proportion of body fat usually go through puberty sooner than their thinner contemporaries, so than their thinner peers. So a lot of puberty is actually genetic, is what we're learning. Hormones affect appetite. There's a hormone called leptin that affects your appetite. It's believed to be involved in the onset of puberty. So in both sexes, if you have chronic malnutrition, puberty is delayed. So if you have these hormones that are making sure you're gaining weight, basically, you're eating properly, your puberty isn't going to be impacted. But if you are not eating properly, if you do not have access to enough food so that you are thin overall, puberty is going to be delayed. 11 or 12 is the most likely age of visible onset. So the rise in hormone levels that signals puberty can happen anywhere between 8 and 14. So it's a huge, huge gap. We have a higher incidence of precocious puberty, which is just sexual development before age of 8. We're not sure why it happens, but one of the theories out there is that the hormones that we're putting in our foods, like chicken, that's why you always see Purdue advertises no antibiotics, no hormones in their chicken. But they were giving antibiotics and hormones to chickens and to prevent them from getting sick, of course. And then we ate the chickens, therefore ingesting those. So that's just a theory. We don't have evidence for it yet, but they are doing research on it. Because out of nowhere, we have 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds going into puberty. There was a 5-year-old that was pregnant in Mexico and had a baby. 5 years old. Think about that for a minute. The secular trend is basically an increase in human growth with increased nutrition. So we're eating better, so we're growing more. The data on puberty over the centuries reveals a huge example of this. Each generation has experienced puberty a few weeks earlier, and so over time it's getting 2 years earlier, and has grown a centimeter or so taller than the one before it. So we have more food, we gain more weight. Early puberty in girls, taller boys and girls. So it's, getting earlier and earlier and earlier. As I said before, I could imagine that soon we'll be teaching that puberty hits normally between the years of 8 and 10. It just keeps getting younger every year, every generation too. The secular trend has slowed or stopped in developed countries because we have adequate nutrition, so that basically allows everyone to get to their potential. In non-developed nations, they are malnutrition, so they don't have this secular trend. They are having delayed puberty, if anything. One interesting little thing, our U.S. presidents are getting taller. James Madison, who was the 4th president, was 5'4". Obama is 6'1". And if you look at the president's height over time, they're getting taller and taller, so that's kind of interesting. But the point is, early puberty seems to be increasing, and height is increasing. Stress hastens the hormonal onset of puberty. As I said, cortisol is the stress hormone. So if you have cortisol released chronically, your body kind of adapts to it, so your immune system goes down. People who are sick, drug addicted, or divorced parents, violent, impoverished neighborhoods, those that suffer from sexual abuse, they have high family conflict. If they have an international adoption at a later age, these things all cause a huge amount of stress. So this huge amount of stress happens, and puberty comes into play. So why does cortisol trigger puberty? Well, again, cortisol has a lot of effects because cortisol is a stress hormone. So cortisol tries to allow your body to handle stress. So it allows you to have access to, glucose that you wouldn't have. And very importantly, it tries to minimize inflammation. So it kind of lowers your immune system ability. So once your immune system is down, that's going to cause a whole nother world of issues. So, like I've said multiple times, figure out how to handle your stress, get a way to get it out, and do not have these issues with your immune system and getting sick all the time, because chronic stress can actually kill you. So when puberty begins too early or too late, we have problems. We kind of talked about this in lecture already. Early maturing girls, more depression, poor body image. Early maturing boys, more aggressive, acting out, that kind of thing. Slow developing boys, usually anxious, depressed, kind of afraid of sex. So we're going to kind of go through that because we've already talked about this in lecture. Growth spurts are sudden, rapid physical growth. This occurs during puberty. Each body part increases in size on a schedule. Height follows the increase in body fat, then you get muscle. So you have this increase in body fat, then you grow like a weed, so to speak, and then you start to gain muscle mass. Your lungs triple in weight, so adolescents breathe more deeply and more slowly. Your heart doubles in size and slows down, so your pulse rate decreases. Your blood pressure will go up a little bit, so adolescents have a tendency to have a little bit higher blood pressure than adults do. Only the lymphoid system decreases in size, so teenagers are less susceptible to respiratory issues. The tonsils and adenoids are lymphoid tissue in the back of your mouth. So those decrease in size, so you're not going to have a lot of tonsillitis or strep throat, that kind of thing. Any kind of respiratory issues, your teenagers are less likely to get them. Your skin becomes oilier, sweatier, more prone to acne. The hair on the head and limbs becomes coarser and darker. You get hair under your arms, on your faces, in your pubic areas. In many ways, hair is more than a growth characteristic. It actually becomes a display of sexuality, because once that pubic hair comes in, it's kind of like you're grown up. Once you have the facial hair, it's kind of like you're a grown up. So it becomes more of a, hey, I'm a grown up, I'm a sexual being kind of thing. Primary versus secondary sex characteristics. Your primary sex characteristics are your vagina, uterus, ovaries, testicles, penis. Those mature and you start to release these hormones. The hormones then make your secondary sex characteristics come out. So those are the observable traits that are not involved in reproduction. So facial hair, lower voice in males, breasts in women, more muscle mass in males, higher voice in females, wider pelvis, that kind of thing. Family dinners have a tendency to conflict with the adolescents wanting to be independent, but family dinners are actually kind of important during adolescence. Not only is it a time for the family to get together, but it's also making sure that your adolescents are getting enough nutrients. Nutrients are very crucial during this growth period because of the growth spurts. But only 16% of high school seniors eat the recommended amount of vegetables, which creates a deficiency. You need vitamins and minerals for normal functioning. Menstruation and intensive sports may deplete your iron, which leads to iron deficiency anemia. Iron is part of the hemoglobin molecule, which is on your red blood cells, and that carries oxygen to your body. Oxygen is very important for your body to generate ATP. So if you do not have enough iron, you're not going to carry enough oxygen to your body parts. So you're not going to be able to generate enough ATP. So if you do intensive physical sports kind of thing, you might need to watch your iron. Menstruation, when women menstruate, they lose a lot of blood. But it's only a temporary thing, so that's usually not a big issue, but the sports thing could become an issue. Body images, again, we're talking about adolescence here, so we have a lot of issues with body image. Body image is how they think they look. Girls diet partly because boys like thin girls. Boys want to be taller and stronger because girls like muscles. So your body image is going to have a lot to do with what is popular at the time kind of thing. If you look at back in the day at Marilyn Monroe, she was kind of a larger girl. And then over time, everybody got so skinny. But now you have people like Kim Kardashian and Nicki Minaj, let's say, who are, getting bigger. So maybe it's starting to trend in the other direction. Who knows? Self-acceptance during this time is difficult. New changes can contribute to this distorted body image. Depression, obsessions with food, which lead to the disorders that we've talked about. Obesity is a problem no matter what the age is. 15% of high school students in 22 states were obese in 2013. But this rate falls during childhood, but then starts to increase during adolescence. You're building your fat, preparing for the growth spurt in height. Sometimes it's too much. If you have erratic eating or you try to take diet pills to lose weight, it's basically called dieting, taking steroids to increase muscle mass, these are going to be a problem, especially since you're only an adolescent and you're not even fully grown yet. So messing with your body by taking these drugs before you're even fully developed can cause a lot of problems later on. Problem is, as we've talked about in class, adolescents don't think about consequences and later on. Anorexia, we talked about it in class. It can be fatal. Basically, you starve yourself. When you do eat the little bit that you're probably forced to eat by your parents, you overexercise or throw up, that's going to kill your digestive tract and your vital organs because they're not getting enough nutrition. So it can kill you. As we saw in the video, she was very, very skinny. Bulimia is binging and purging, vomiting or taking laxatives. In 2013, within a previous 6 months period, 6.5% of high school girls and 2.2% of boys took laxatives or vomited to lose weight. That's a low percentage, but it should be 0. We should not have adolescents taking laxatives or vomiting trying to lose weight. And bulimics can be really thin like anorexics, or they can be regular sized people. So bulimia is one of those that sometimes it's really hard to tell if somebody is bulimic. Binge eating disorders are characterized by periodic and compulsive overeating to the point that you're in pain. It's done secretly, at least weekly for months. You don't purge. You feel out of control, distressed, depressed. So the difference between binge eating disorders and bulimia is the throwing up or laxatives. You don't do that with binge eating. You do that with bulimia. And we're going to kind of be done with the disorders because we talked about them already in lecture. So, different parts of the brain grow at different rates. The limbic system, your fear emotional responses, your impulses, matures before the prefrontal cortex, which is your emotional regulation, your planning ahead. So emotional areas develop before the reflective ones do. So that is one reason why adolescents are a lot more impulsive and they don't think about consequences. They don't think about the after, as opposed to adults. They're not mature yet. It may seem like they're mature, but they're not. So this is a chart showing you that the amount of gray matter actually goes down over time. The amount of white matter increases. So by the time you are at the age of 20, you have a lot more white matter than gray matter. Gray matter are the cell bodies. White matter are your axons, your neurons, making the connections, okay? So this can be due to pruning, not using certain neurons, making connections with new neurons. So even though at age 10, 15, it might seem like you have an adult brain, you really don't have an adult brain yet. So you can't think like an adult does. So again, making new connections is part of maturing. So white matter increases in the brain. So don't think that a 15, 16-year-old can think like an adult, because they just don't have the machinery to think like an adult yet. They haven't made all of the connections necessary to think like an adult yet. Logic shut down when emotions are intense, especially with their peers. The logical part of the brain shuts down and it gets emotional only. So when stress, passion, drugs, deprivation is really extreme, the adolescent brain is overtaken by impulses. So on average, sensation seeking accelerates rapidly during puberty. Impulsivity during puberty, they decline with maturity. So as you can see to the right, adolescents become less impulsive as they mature, but they do still enjoy new sensations. So the impulsivity goes down a lot. The sensation seeking goes down too, but not as much as impulsivity. So they still enjoy that thrill, but they're not going to be as impulsive to get that thrill, which is a good thing. Increased myelination, we've talked about this multiple times. Increase in myelination increases transmission. Slower inhibition increases reaction time. Positive neurotransmitters are going to promote pleasurable experiences, and we have synaptic growth that enhances our moral development and open to new experiences, new ideas, making new connections. Piaget, his fourth and final stage of cognitive development was formal operational thought, characterized by systemic logic and the ability to think about abstract ideas. So we talked about this in class already, but real quick, we talked about adolescent egocentrism, which is basically an adolescent interpreting everybody else's behavior as if they're judging them. The personal fable, where you think all of your experiences are unique and either totally better or awful compared to somebody else's. The invisibility fable, where you think nobody can hurt you, nobody can harm you. And the imaginary audience, where you always think you're being watched, like you're on stage. So we've already kind of talked about that. Problem with all of those is they're not reality. So that's a problem with adolescents. How they think is not reality, oftentimes. We talked about Piaget's experiment already with the 4-year-old, 7-year-old, 10-year-old, and 14-year-old. 4-year-old had no clue how to balance the sides out. The 7-year-old kind of figured, well, if I put weights on each side that are the same weight, they'll balance out, but didn't know why they didn't. The 10-year-old, trial and error, figured it out. And the 14-year-old reasoned it out, hypothesized, and figured it out. So, deductive reasoning is reasoning from a general statement through logical steps to figure out specifics. Sometimes it's called top-down reasoning. So it goes from general to specific. Inductive is the opposite. You reason from more specific experiences to a general conclusion. So this is less cognitively advanced than deduction, and it's called bottom-up reasoning. But deductive reasoning is like what Sherlock Holmes used to use. Well, if he is a man, then he has to be this kind of thing. So going from general statements to, and he is a killer kind of thing. Inductive reasoning is what we do in science. We take specifics, we hypothesize specific questions, specific observations, and then hopefully lead to a general conclusion about something. Hypothetical thought includes possibilities that may not even be reality. It's all hypothetical. When people say hypothetically speaking, it's not a real scenario. It could be, but it could also be way off the wall. So we talked about this too real quick in the class, the dual process model. 2 modes of thinking exist, one for intuitive emotional responses, one for analytical reasoning. So intuitive thought is more emotion, your gut feelings, your hunch, based on past experiences. Analytical thought is logic and rationale. So you look at the pros, the cons, the consequences, and get the possibilities, the facts all together. You analyze it all and come up with a conclusion. Today's teens are digital natives. Most secondary school students use technology. We use technology here. I'm using technology right now. Internet use is not included as an addiction in the DSM-5, but some people say it should be. Some people are addicted to the internet, especially adolescents, and as we're going to find out, parents might look at that as pathological behavior. You shouldn't be addicted to the internet. But part of the thing is that a lot of schools actually use it now. Just last night, my son had to go on the website to do Google app things or something, and he had to highlight and use this website to do his homework. So everybody is using technology. So how can we really say it's a bad thing? You know, it's the extent that it's used that could become question. So we have a decline in the number of teenagers exposed to online sexual predators. It's most likely to be a younger person that they know. Again, adults may think that normal teen behavior is pathological, but it's not necessarily. That's the thing. Online sexual predators were rampant when we first got the internet. However, it's gone down, which is a good thing. Cyberbullying. It's bullying that occurs on the internet. It can be texting, anonymous phone calls, embarrassing videos, fake Facebook pages. Anonymity is the key because you don't know who it is, and that often brings out the worst in people. I just watched the movie Nerve last night with my husband, and it was all about an online game who you had screen names, nobody really knew who you were, and in the end they revealed who everybody was, so they all quit the game kind of thing. Sorry if I just ruined a movie for you, but the whole point was that it was all anonymous. So everybody wanted to watch. Everybody wanted to do this because nobody knew who they were. Once they knew who they were, they stopped. So it's kind of interesting. Cyberbullying is intent to harm, so it is a bad thing. And like I said, because you can hide behind a screen name, it makes it a lot easier, unfortunately. So this internet addiction thing, again, China actually has rehab centers for internet addiction, which is kind of strange to me, but they actually can get abusive to their patients trying to keep them off the internet, which is kind of crazy to me. But cyberbullying uses the anonymity of the internet to serve its purpose. So, how do you handle that? Sexting, sending sexual photographs. About 30% of adolescents have done this. You forward pictures without the sender's knowledge. That could be a problem. So if somebody sexts a picture to you and then you send it to somebody else, that could become a problem. People can experience depression if the reaction is negative, like if you sext a provocative photo of yourself and the receiver's like, that's going to cause some negative feelings there. And it's very dangerous because you don't know who is going to get the person's phone you sent it to. Even if you send it to somebody you trust, you don't know who's going to get that phone, or if he could accidentally forward it or on purpose forward it to others, like the little group there. So you're better off not to do things like that. Secondary education is, of course, the period after primary education and before tertiary. So it's between elementary or grade school and before college. So we're talking about high school for the most part. Usually between 11 and 18, but the age varies by school and by nation. Transition from one school to another can impair your ability to function and learn. Going from middle school to high school can be rough because in middle school you have your group of friends, but then in high school it's a bunch of middle schools coming together. So that can always be a rough transition, especially if your growth spurt is happening. If you're starting to develop, that's going to create more stress for you. Middle school for children after elementary school, before high school, so 6th through 8th. Often there's a mismatch between student needs and school context. You find an increase in bullying here. Friendships are complicated. Parents underestimate the amount of daily stress that 6th through 8th graders go through. Academic excellence recognition can be challenging. Grade 6 through 8, middle school there, is kind of a tough age for children to be in. And then, like I said, what do they have to look forward to? High school, with even more schools coming together. So you have your middle schools, like here we have Heiser, Houston, and Highland. All three of those schools then combine to go to the freshman school. So that causes a lot of stress on middle schoolers because they know what they have coming. And if they're getting bullied and having these complications in middle school, is it going to be worse in high school? That's things they worry about. So, the entity theory of intelligence sees ability as innate, so you're born with it genetically. It's present at birth. Doesn't believe that effort enhances your achievement. The incremental theory of intelligence says that it can be increased by effort, so you can master whatever you want if you pay attention, participate, and study. I'm more on the side of the incremental theory of intelligence because I do think that effort matters. I think that we all have the same capabilities. It's the amount of effort that you put into it. And as I've told you guys are all smart. You can all do this. You just have to put the effort in. In theory and in practice, high schools promote students' ability. They want them to go to college for the most part. In the U.S., we have an increasing number of high school students enrolled in classes that are actually more rigorous and require them to pass externally scored exams. We have things like the College Bound program, Upward Bound. We have early college programs. We have dual credit programs. These all work with the colleges to kind of make it easier for the students to make the transition. And at the same time, they can get college credit, which I think is one of the good things about this place. A high-stakes test is basically going to make or break you. It's any kind of test where it's going to determine your success or failure. So if you're graduated or not graduating, if you're promoted or not promoted. 24 U.S. states use this, so 74% of high school students have to take this high-stakes test. I believe in this high-stake test for like your master's degree. If you don't pass it, you shouldn't get your master's degree, which they do have that. We do that. That's what I had to do. So I totally believe in that. High school, I think that there should be some sort of testing. I don't think you should just graduate because you were physically in class or even not in class. Sometimes they just graduated everybody. I don't believe in that. But I think if you put forth the effort that you should be able to graduate. I already looked at this, but it just shows you that the percentage of kids dropping out of school has gone down significantly, which is a great thing. The Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, is taken by 15-year-olds in 50 nations. It's designed to measure your daily life abilities, basically. U.S. students perform lower compared to other nations, and so I'm not sure if that's great or not. But the PISA and international comparisons of high school dropout rates suggest that U.S. secondary education can be improved for those who do not go to college. So if you're not going to go to college, there is room for improvement in our high schools. And I believe that that is true. There is room for improvement in our high schools. I do think that the dual credit that we do and early college and all of that is awesome. But some kids just aren't cut out for college. And what do we do about them? How do we help them? That's another question.